Lofink opens here with a look at the way that the priestly writers, or P for short, adapted the Enuma Elish, like we talked about in the earlier modules. One of the points he makes is that God hangs the sun and the moon in the sky like mere utensils, right? These aren't gods anymore. They are just decorations, so to speak. I mean, our tools, right? Like you might hang a lantern or something by your tent when you're camping, right? He calls this a demythologization so radical that we can scarcely appreciate it now, right? I mean, we just kind of read it, yeah, and then he hung the moon and the sun. But for the people of that time, this would have been like, what? Like, no, the sun is a god, right? The moon is a god themselves. You don't just hang them someplace, right? They are born out of other gods, or they have to fight some monster or something, you know. They are the power. Nope, not in this story. In this story, there's, a tool of God, so to speak. When God parts the waters to create the world, there's no fight. It's not a chaos. The waters of chaos aren't a monster. They're not a divinity. They're just waters, and he parts them and creates the world with no struggle. So again, we see here that God has a dominion over, right, the other gods, which we'll see, which we saw, are not just expressions of the forces of nature or human desires. Those things are not divine. Right? God alone, the holy other, is. Here's one. God works, then rests. That didn't happen in the Enuma Elish. In the Enuma Elish, the Mesopotamian gods didn't work at all. Right? Well, they did it one time, they didn't like it. So then they made these lesser gods to do the work for them, taking care of the earth, producing yummy foods and stuff. But they didn't like it either, and they rebelled. They revolted against the higher gods. And so then they made humans. These are good slaves, right? And so that's the way, people were programmed to think about themselves in the Mesopotamian culture. That's the way it worked in Egypt too, right? The Pharaoh was a god. You weren't, and so you worked and he didn't, right? So this idea where God rests and then humans rest with him, this is, as Lofing puts it, critical of the whole ancient world, in which leisure was for the free and work was for the women and slaves, right? So this is different. This is... No, everybody works and everybody rests. Right? So in this, he proposes a new society in which creative work and divine rest alternate for everybody. Right? Again, when we look at the history of the Israelites, we can see how God revealed this to them. Right? This is what Lofink was talking about in the first section of this chapter. As God separated them, as God liberated them from these oppressive cultures, right? They could see this better vision of God. I once had a student, and I have to admit, it didn't seem like he was paying attention much all the time, and sometimes teaching gets a little frustrating. And I have to admit, I was just kind of frustrated, and I was just like, oh, this guy's not paying attention again. And I said, Joey, what? You want to tell me, about what archaeology has to tell us? And I'm a little embarrassed, but, I was frustrated. And you want to tell us what archaeology has to tell us about the story of how the Israelites came to power in the Promised Land? And he looked at me for a few seconds, and he looked kind of shocked that he was being called upon in class. And he said, "Slaves take over." And it was beautiful. It was just one of the most wonderful moments in my professional career. I was embarrassed and proud at the same time, right? Because the kid nailed it. In 3 words, he hit the Israelite experience. slaves take over. When the slaves and peasants and other fringe groups kind of took over Israel, when they first went out and lived in the pioneer, and then eventually formed a confederacy and controlled the area to some extent, they didn't become the new kings, you see, right? They weren't like, oh, we took over, now we're going to be the kings who rest and everybody else works. No, they had a new vision of God and a new vision of society, one in which everyone works and everyone rests, right? Everyone has a relationship with the divine, right? Not just the guy in charge. So if we move on to the end of the first creation story, it's kind of wrapped up with this phrase: these are the generations or births of the heaven and the earth while they were created. Now this has been translated in various ways, like this is the story of creation. But what the word actually means, dot in Hebrew, is generations, and it is a way that the authors of Genesis 1 in the beginning of 2, the first creation story, they really preserve that from the Enuma Elish. So they use the Enuma Elish framework for the story. They don't change that word. That's the same word that the Enuma Elish use when it describes the creation of the heavens and the earth. But in the Enuma Elish, it makes sense because it's a sky god and an earth goddess procreating, right? So the generation is actually like born, right? Just like animals and humans procreate today. But in the Genesis story, it's not like that. There's not a union of the earth and sky goddess, but the word is preserved, right? And you see God, through God's word, these things are generated, are born, right? Now, what this shows, P, is the generative power of the earth. The earth is creating these things as commanded by God. So God is creating indirectly here, right? Like he says, let the earth bring forth vegetation, right? He doesn't say, oh, I create out of nothing an oak tree. I create out of nothing an amoeba. I create out of nothing sorry, I guess amoeba is an animal, right? So we're still on plants here. But again, the same thing happens for animals, right? Let the earth bring forth living creatures, right? The same thing happens. So he doesn't say, I'm going to create out of nothing a sea slug, right? No, the earth does it, right? It does it at his commands, but as Lofink points out, did P sense that God had placed within the creation itself the power to develop and bring forth life. You see where he's going with this, right? He's going to evolution, right? Did God create the world indirectly through something like evolution? And did P get this already? Yeah. These things, again, nature's not God. It's not the sky and the earth having children through typical procreative functions, right? No, what is it? It's the creation itself having the power to develop and bring forth life as directed by God. It fits very well with a theistic theory of evolution. Okay, so this Tola dot is not just used for the creation of the animals and the plants. It's also used for humans, right? From Adam all the way to Abraham and Jacob / Israel. So this is when the Bible puts these begats and these genealogies that link the various groups that it tells stories about together. In Genesis, they use that same word, toledot. Now, what's the point? Well, Lofink says that history, it's trying to show you that history is not something that's added to creation, as if you have this creation and then on top of it you have a human history. No, the creation is from the beginning also designed by God so that it will unfold itself in history. So the human history is part of the evolutionary process through which God creates the earth. Right? And you see this in the motif of blessing. Be fruitful and multiply. Right? This is what God tells the human beings after he creates them in the first Genesis story. It's what he tells them again after the flood in chapter 9 of Genesis. And it's fulfilled in Exodus when we see the Israelites being very fruitful and multiplying beyond the containment capacities of the Egyptians. Right? And so Lofink describes this as the unfolding of what God had placed within creation already in the course of the 6 days of God's created work. So God's creating the world in such a way so that it will unfold in the history of the Israelites being fruitful and multiplying. So Lofink is making the point here that creation becomes history, right? Creation unfolds in such a way that it expresses that it is being expressed in and through human history, right? But it also works the other way. History becomes creation, right? And points out Isaiah in chapter 40 to 55. He sees history as creation. He says, making the point, when God leads the Israelites out of Babylon, out of the Babylonian exile, back into Zion, God will be creating something utterly new and unheard of. Right? So through human history, that's part of the process of growth and development that is part and parcel of the whole evolution of creation. You see what he's saying here? Right. And for us, this really opens up. I mean, I don't know if previous times in history, people probably didn't think that there was 12 billion years of process going on, right? They didn't think about like, wow, this is for us to get to here, right? And move onwards. There's really been a lot that has gone on. Right, so he brings up the question, why such an arduous process? Why evolution and human history? And he starts here with the whole evolution of species and the evolutionary nature of the universe to get to the point where there was complex life on Earth. And he says, this is again 12 or more billion years, right? Why is the universe exploding and developing for 12 or more billion years? This seems kind of rough. And also, like, why did it take so long even for humans to appear? Before we got to human history and the way that evolves as a part of creation. Why did it take so long just to get to there, right? And what about all these wrong turns and dead ends in evolution that apparently led to nowhere? What about all the species that just died out? Right? What about all the species that were in conflict with each other? Eating each other kind of to survive. What about the Neanderthals? Right? That's the one I always think about. They seem nice enough, right? Didn't they a nice group? Did they live their lives? And apparently they had a very developed emotional lives and familiar societies and things like, they were a lot like us. Why'd they have to die out? Seems kind of rough on them. They only survived through 3% of our DNA or something. So this is the kind of question that he's asking, like, why did God do it this way? It seems like kind of a rough way. Um, it seems like a lot of things just ended up as dead ends or going nowhere within the evolutionary process. And he says then, again, human history is part of this evolutionary process. Why all the wrong turns and dead ends, right? Why do you have all these highly developed societies? And if we look back and try to trace some of the development of some of these societies, some of them were quite civilized, really see the things just growing in the right direction, and then they fall apart and they're done, right? These great civilizations of the past. And why do we end up why the wrong turns? Why do we have these terrible wars? Why do we have child soldiers is the example I put a picture of here. So all kinds of terrible things, right, have happened within the human history. We say, well, we're evolving as a society, we're growing. Yeah, true, but we can see that happening. But we also see these terrible, steps back, so to speak, right? Where, oops, now it seems like we're going in the wrong direction, right? This is kind of an experience maybe that some Americans are having now. We see the idea within politics today that, okay, wait a minute, we're going the wrong direction now, right? Something needs to change, right? Again, not being political here, but look at the idea of change, right? And that we're going in the wrong direction has been a major theme of both major parties. So Lofink is going to bring up the question then, why is there a history at all? Why is there an evolution, right? Why did God do it this way? Why 12 billion years of mostly things that didn't lead up to much, right? Mostly 12 billion years of things that are a lot of dog eat dog, so to speak, things. A lot of death and suffering, right? What's the deal? Well, he says, imagine the opposite first. If you want to understand the way it is, think about if it wasn't that way, right? And so, what would the opposite of development and evolution? What would the opposite of this process of changing and growing life be? Well, it would be everything created in its final form. It would just things would be frozen the way they are. Right? It would be no choice, no free will. Everything would just be created the way that it is meant to be in its final form. Right? You would just be where you were headed to. Right? Think about that. So this would then mean that there would be no free will. You wouldn't have choices to go this way or that way because you wouldn't be going anywhere. Right? Nothing would be moving in any direction, much less in a forward progression of sorts, as we see in the process of evolution and human history at times, right? So it's like Lofink puts it, the possibility of changing oneself presumes constant movement in human beings and in the world around them, right? A person can only change, and that's what happens in the process of evolution in human history. We see change, right? That's what goes on. A person can only change, that can only happen if he or she can enter into a new constellation of reality, right? So there has to be the possibility of doing things different way. There has to be movement in order for there to be choice and free will, right? You can't just be frozen, perfect, so to speak, right? You have to say, I can move over here, or I can move over here. There's a new way of seeing things and doing things, and here's a new way of seeing things and doing things. I can't just, since things are always changing, I can't just stay in the same way of doing things, right? So you got to make some choices. And he uses the story of Zacchaeus, who changed his life just kind of by the subtle choice of, I want to climb up this tree and see Jesus, right? And it as he has a new perspective from climbing up the tree, right, he can see things in a wider way. All of a sudden, he sees these new, he's open to these new constellations, and he accepts Jesus inviting himself over to his house, and he's opened up and living in now a whole new constellation, a whole new reality, where instead of trying to hoard things for himself, he is sharing things. He is sharing his things with others, right? Just like God is sharing his very self with us in and through his creation. So, as Lofink puts it, history is nothing but a sequence of constantly new constellation of reality presented to human freedom. Right? So you can see that he's seeing the main element of reality. Right? This angle that he's taking is he's starting with human freedom. Right? He says that's the biggest reality in our lives. Right? And that in turn presupposes a constant movement of things and people. That the free will or choices that human beings have, that's the realest thing that we experience in some ways. So what is there that makes that possible, right? What is the possibility, the condition for the possibility of this experience of free will? Well, it's this constant movement of things and people, right? I got to be able to go over there or go over here. Right? I got to be able to, things are always moving where I'm at too, so that it's not possible just to sit right there, right? And so he makes a statement there that evolution and history are therefore crucially bound up with human freedom. You understand how it all goes together, right? You have movement and therefore you have choice. The movement is the framework, right, in which choice is revealed. So therefore, right, God desires that creation should be much greater and freer than we imagine it. So he sees the will of God in this, right, that this is what God's trying to do. This is God's will, that we are free. So why didn't God just create us perfectly loving, right? Why didn't God just create us, right, in our final form, right, in that potential in which we are have the ability to develop into now? Well, because it would eliminate free will, right? We have to have the choice not to love, right, if we're going to choose to love. And that's what love is. Love is an expression of free will. Love is when you care about someone, right? When you want to help them, but you don't have to, right? It's something you choose to do because you love the person, right? And so he points out that God, the way that God created us through this process, this arduous process of development and evolution, shows that he loves us. Because if you love someone, you will their development. If you love someone, you give them the time to become the person that they can be. You give them the time to develop into the person who can love, right? Who can realize that possibility, right? Who can respond to the love you have for them in freedom, right? I mean, there's all kinds of corny love songs about this, right? You can't make someone love you, right? And God is not desiring human love because he has some kind of a confidence problem, right? God desires humans to not specifically to love him, but to love like him, right? To share in his divine nature, right? To love unconditionally so that we can experience his joy. Because that's what love does. It creates and shares itself. And you can't share love without free will. And you can't have free will without this constant movement and choice. Therefore, right? Creation through a developmental process. One final point Lofink makes in this chapter, which is somewhat superfluous to what we've been talking about so far, but he points out that for the Israelites, in contrast to the Neoplatonist Greek philosophers, the superabundance of created things is a sign of the overflowing goodness of God. So the diversity of life, right? And again, our understanding might be a little even more profound than theirs in this, because we understand like that there's been not just the diversity of life that we see on Earth now, but there's been countless, species that have come and gone, right, within the process of bringing things to what they are now, right, and bringing things to what they will be in the future. So this is a sign of God's generosity, his prodigal nature.